I have a question for you. How much time do you intentionally spend taking care of other people each week? Understanding that weeks vary, it's not always necessarily going to be the same, but just getting a ballpark idea of how much time you spend caring for others. And whatever that is, if you want to take a moment and pause this while you reflect and see what that is, that's fine. Go ahead. And once you have an answer, make a mental note. And let's ask a different question. How much time do you spend intentionally taking care of yourself each week? And how do those compare? Hi, I'm Ted Meissner, and I teach mindfulness, burnout prevention, and a host of other things that are related to all of that. And I'm happy to say that as of this episode, Mindfulness Voyage is now on Spotify. They do video podcasts now, as well as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and a few other spots, and I'll be providing links in the description. I teach primarily in healthcare and corporate environments, where many of the people who take the courses that I teach are caregivers themselves. And the question that I just asked you is one that I ask in my courses. And what I found is that many caregivers might not be quite as good at taking care of themselves as they are at taking care of others. That's why I brought in our guest today, Mick Krasner. He has been working in this field for many, many years. So, come on, let's talk with Mick and learn a little bit more. Our guest today is Mick Krasner. Mick, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you again.
Oh, it's really good to be here, Ted. Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to this conversation.
Me too, and in particular because you're one of the other people who is in the same territory of mindfulness that I am, which is primarily delivering and caring for people in healthcare. So this is one of the things I'm really interested in speaking about with you, because you've been doing this in this particular kind of mindfulness in healthcare for a very long time. I'm wondering if you might give a little bit of a summary of your background for those who might be new to you.
Okay, so a summary about the background related to the mindfulness work. Yeah.
Yep.
So I am a physician and practicing internal medicine at an academic medical center here in Rochester, New York. And at some point, many years ago, probably early in my practice life, it was kind of after training when I realized that, things were challenging. I encountered mindfulness. Actually, it was in the early 1990s. And I think what I had seen was the Bill Moyer special, Healing and the Mind, that so many of us, had that entree into mindfulness, that talked about and showed the work of the stress reduction clinic at the University of Massachusetts. And I was really taken by it. So I began at that point to make some contacts in my community here in Rochester, New York, to learn a little bit about meditation, and started sitting at the local Rochester Zen Center, which actually was quite a well-known center that was started by Roshi Philip Kapleau, who's one of, I would say, the two major sort of folks who brought Zen to the West.
Three Pillars of Zen was one of my favorite and first introductions to Zen meditation itself.
Yes. And then around the time that show came out, I don't know if it was simultaneous or around that time, I got a hold of Full Catastrophe Living, the book, read that, and that was really fascinating. And then my father became ill, and I sent him the book, and he began to meditate, and he had a very serious terminal illness and wound up living with that illness much, much, much longer than would have otherwise been expected. And at that point, I got a little more serious. I also realized that I was struggling with early career, building my medical practice, all the academic demands, and then a family. At this point, I had a few children. And so life was like what was described in the book, The Full Catastrophe. And so I made my way, as so many of us have, to the University of Massachusetts and began some training. actually started Omega and then started in the teacher training sequence that was so beautifully crafted and so impactful. And I'm still very close to many of the people that I trained with, and all of us still, most of us still have this as a really central feature in our lives. Well, when I came back from that, I decided I could start, or in the middle of that process, I started teaching MBSR. And initially with patients, and then over time, I began to have participants who were physicians in the community come into the course. And about 2003, 2004, I was approached by a couple of the physicians asking me about continuing education credit and would I ever consider crafting a mindfulness course based on MBSR that would be just for physicians that they can get continuing education credit for. And they also like the idea of being amongst their peers. There was a sense, and I understand it a lot more now, of isolation, of feeling really alone in your work, even though we work with people all the time, but especially alone from your colleagues, isolated from your colleagues. So I started running courses for full MBSR programs, and they would fill up with community physicians. Some were academics, some were just in the community, whatnot. And then about mid 2006, 2007, I saw an advertisement in the New England Journal of Medicine for a foundation, a fairly new foundation that was formed out of a lawsuit, a settlement of a class action lawsuit against a large national health insurer. And in this foundation, they were sending out, requesting their second round of proposal requests for programs. And in their priority areas, one of them, among the priorities they wanted to fund, were people doing work on physician wellness. So I got together with, I'm not an academic in the sense my career was mostly clinical. I got together with a few colleagues here in Rochester who are academic, who do that kind of work. And by the way, several of them had made their way into my MBSR class, like Ron Epstein and Tim Quill and Howard Beckman and Tony Suchman. And I got these folks together and said, why don't we apply for this grant to fund a program? We could create a novel program that would be designed to meet some of the needs as we saw it of our health professionals, physicians and other health professionals. And we wrote the grant. I was the project director, took the lead in writing the grant, and we were funded. And we had this year-long program, which we now call Mindful Practice. At the time, Ted, it was called Mindful Communication when we first developed it. And we brought in three elements. My sense was always to have the container of it being mindfulness. So I consider it a mindfulness-based intervention or mindfulness-based program. But within that, we thought long and hard about what gives health professionals meaning. And a lot of it is, for most, in fact, I think most of our health professionals would say the patients, the encounters, the work we do, the care that we give, and how we do that. But very few of us have much time to reflect upon those encounters in a narrative way, in a way of looking at what's the impact on my sense of well-being and my sense of meaning by doing that work. You know, the kinds of narratives that we do are medical histories that are really designed for, nowadays, they're designed for maximizing reimbursement more than just about anything. So that was narrative medicine. And then we also thought, well, you know, there's a lot of pain points in medicine. Grief. We experience grief when we encounter loss. We are affected by the suffering that we meet every day. We make errors. We're human, and it's very shameful, and it's a very stigmatized part of our work. How do we work with that? We have conflict with patients, with colleagues, with staff. So all these dynamics that aren't unique actually to medicine, but in some ways they have their own flavor in medicine. And we didn't want to, we wanted to address these things, but we did not want to create an environment where there's a group of people just complaining about things. So we brought in this technology, I could call it, called appreciative inquiry. And what appreciative inquiry is it's a change management approach that is, rather than being problem focused, it's strength focused. So it's looking at challenges and then identifying what are the strengths and capacities. For example, I'll give you an example, errors. We make errors. Many of us experience these errors in our work, or we've seen others make errors. How do we get through them? What do we do with that? What are the qualities that we call upon in ourselves to help us continue to show up for work and take care of our patients, knowing that this has happened to us? So that's sort of a corollary of this appreciative inquiry, strength-based approach. So we put this together with this very much a mindfulness based with contemplative medicine, contemplative practice focus as the container. And we created this year-long program and we recruited 70 physicians to go through it. And we measured a lot of things, including mindfulness, but we measured burnout, other measures of well-being. We measured psychosocial orientation. We measured personality, because we were interested in whether there were certain personality types that would do better than others. And we've had pretty tremendous results, positive results, lower burnout scores, improved well-being overall, improved relationship with patients, how we orient ourselves toward our patients, enhanced empathy. And interestingly enough, shifts in personality. These doctors in our program were about 16 years into practice. Who would have thought that what's considered a trait by the time you're well established as an adult would actually shift, increased conscientiousness, increased emotional stability? I think it comes no surprise to many of your listeners because many of them have been engaged in mindfulness. But the other thing is that those improvements correlated very strongly with improvements in mindfulness scores over the course of this program. Well, we were surprised that JAMA agreed to publish it because it really wasn't a controlled study, and there were so many things about it that really made it really pilot. But they thought there had never been anyone really looking into this kind of thing before, and so they were very happy to publish it, which was great. And we were inundated with inquiries about where people could learn this. We had no idea. We weren't in the business of let's create a program and teach people. We were just very curious about how this approach would work. So that led to the development now about 14 years ago of our Mindful Practice in Medicine training program. And we've had several thousand physicians and other health professionals, mixed health professionals, go through this program. We have a teacher training sequence, and we have teachers now all over the world who do this. So we've updated our research, published something a year and a half, 2 years ago, showing that our 4-day core workshop has pretty much the same findings as this year-long program, including findings about teamwork, improved teamwork, work engagement, things that people at work would really want to know. Burnout, unfortunately, is really a huge challenge. Most recent survey on Medscape, over 9,000 physicians surveyed, 49% are suffering, and it is suffering from burnout because it impacts the literature connecting our well-being with quality of care is inarguable. I mean, the connection there is so strong. So I'll stop there. I've talked for a while, but was asked to kind of walk your listeners through that time course. But that's where we are now, 14 years later, doing this Mindful Practice in Medicine program.
Yeah, you mentioned so many interesting things I want to unpack with you, and we will. You had just mentioned this metric that's a new one on physician burnout, about 49%. And I use a very similar number, 48%, as people who are somewhat or always burned out in a particular research that was done some year or two ago. And what I do in my burnout course, and the first session is I give what's the percentage you think it is? And I put up 85, 48, 26, and 47 or something like that, or some other number. And overwhelmingly, most people who are on the call, who are in healthcare primarily, say 85%.
Wow.
And I say, okay, well, the good news is we do a drum roll on our desk and I give them the reveal and it's 48%, or the updated number for you, 49%. I say, okay, so here's the thing. And so many people express surprise at that and shock, and they'll have little emojis of the open face. And I'll say, we're seeing it as amazing that it's only just about every other one of us is experiencing burnout. We're guessing, our impression about it, our perception is that it's even higher. And that itself is something that people realize, oh, this is really something I need to pay attention to. And it has been consistent because I've used that for a couple of years now, every quarter. And it's the same thing. People usually guess the highest number. So it's interesting to hear from you that you're seeing this metric. And I was like, yeah, if you ask people, they'll think it's even more than that. You also mentioned, and I really like this about and admire this about the work you've been doing all along, is you mentioned several different kinds of measures. And you can do this with physicians. They understand, yes, we need this kind of data to see, is this effective or not? And one of the measures you had in there was mindfulness and other stuff too. And the reason that I find that particularly interesting and helpful is I honestly don't care if people going through my mindfulness course can count their breaths without losing track. I don't care. What I care about is that helping you in ways in your life? It's great if this particular skill is something you've practiced, but we see from other research, when using an app to do a particular task, you get good at that task. That doesn't necessarily translate into other areas. So very glad that you're doing those kinds of measures too. Now, you mentioned a few things in there about some of the needs, some of the challenges that are specific to healthcare. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that, about some of the unique circumstances that healthcare professionals might be in that we might not find in pure academia or in the business world, the kinds of things where mindfulness might be helpful or in some ways more challenging for healthcare staff to get into.
Yeah, boy, it's a large subject. It's a big topic. If you just think about your own experiences with the medical establishment, and especially your own direct experience with a health professional receiving care, being on the receiving end of care, it's very intimate. People go to the doctor to maintain their health. They go to other health professionals for health maintenance, but people show up a lot when there is something wrong, when there's something in distress. So there are high emotions involved. There are often high expectations. There are elements of existential questions about will I live? Will I not live? These are very real questions that health professionals, physicians, and others face regularly, depending on what specialty you're in. There are other questions. Will I ever get better? I worked for many, many years as an internal medicine specialist. So most of my work is in chronic disease management. Chronic disease by its nature means it will probably not get better, but how to live, how to learn to continue to develop your life, your interests, and your connections, and be in your community with the presence of this thing in your life. So there's all of those things. We're also in an environment where there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. This is really interesting because it's not something that I learned much about in my medical training. Medical training, at least when I was trained, focused a lot on knowledge proficiency, really developing that fund of knowledge and then figuring out how to apply that knowledge. But it seemed to be more challenging to train people in how to manage uncertainty. So these are many of these things, being in a high emotionally stressed situations, confronting suffering daily, having your own empathic resonance with that. So feeling your own suffering in that, being aware of that, and being in very uncertain territory. These are all areas that I think mindfulness has um, a lot of applications to directly to those kinds of things. Not to mention that, what do we do in medicine as a clinician is we are in the business of paying close attention, noticing and observing, and actually without judgment, really noticing and taking in whatever it is that shows up. Uh, so the foundations of mindfulness, and where that information has come from, is the foundations of awareness of my own somatic awareness, my own affective awareness, uh, and how that can impact with, if I'm not aware of that, my decision making and how I filter that information, and then my own cognitions, my own biases, and my own ways of thinking. Third foundation of mindfulness. These are all central to what it means to practice medicine or be a good clinician, whether you're in behavioral health or whether you're a surgeon or whether you're a family practitioner, whether you're a nurse practitioner in psychiatry, whatever it is that you're doing in clinical work. I hope that answers that question, or at least begins to connect that together for
Yeah,
you.
it starts to scratch that surface of a very large topic of here's why mindfulness is so important within this field. It is also important in other fields, but here are some of the particular nuances we have. Particularly interesting is that one of that practice, shall we say, of distance from a patient that we might be seeing in some way, for those who are physicians or nurses or other healthcare professionals, but also how in some ways that may sometimes rob us of the emotional support we get from being able to make a difference and to provide that care that may have brought many of us into healthcare in the first place. But over time, there's a natural human tendency to want to pull away from that perceived distress, and that maybe turning towards that and our ability to make some difference, even if that difference is I can be there for that person, and that itself can be incredibly helpful to them. And as you know from working with those with chronic conditions, can make a very big difference when the medical condition itself might not be something we can impact that much.
Yeah. Well, let me say a couple things about these issues that you brought up. Detachment or detached concern was certainly a paradigm in medical training for many, many, many years. The idea being that you can't make good decisions if you're clouded by emotions. And now we know it is much more complex than that. And actually, our emotional engagement probably has healing qualities to it, for one thing, and also gives us information for another thing, and so and also connects us with patients. And feeling connected is a very important part of that, the translation of what happens in the healing and in the health care encounter, in healing encounters, we could say. So I think we've come part of the way. We've come in some ways a long way toward acknowledging that. On the other hand, there can be just the volume of intense suffering and difficulties that one encounters depending on the kind of work within medicine one is engaged in, that you do in some ways have to protect yourself. Now, we have partly a partial antidote, which I'd like to talk about, and that is compassion. So actually, we know there have been studies when you use some of the empathy scales to measure health professional empathy, and then you use some burnout scales. The most commonly used burnout scale is the Maslow Burnout Inventory, which measures burnout on 3 domains: emotional exhaustion, depersonalization or objectifying things around you, cynicism we could call it, and then a low sense of personal accomplishment. But if you look at empathy measures, they can, in some studies, track with burnout. So the greater one is empathic, the more one is at risk for burnout. Well, think about that for a second. Empathy, even the nature of the word itself, empathos, in the pathos, the pathology, the passion, in the suffering. It has to do with resonating emotionally, cognitively with that suffering. In some ways, how it works is mysterious. We know a little bit about the neuroscience of that, mirror neurons, etc. But one is feeling, and if you look at functional imaging, you can see areas of the brain that are resonating. They're in pain as we're seeing things that are in pain. How can that possibly be good? But we do know that compassion, which is just a nuanced shift with that, which is compassion with the suffering, has the connotation that not only do we recognize that there's suffering present, but we have decided to take action or do something about it, or intend to, or incline ourselves toward addressing that suffering. And I think I say partial antidote because we are in some ways very blessed as health professionals, aren't we? Because we have, that's our job, is to enact compassion. And we know evolution tells us, and our physiology tells us that that's a good thing for a social species to reinforce compassionate action. And how is that reinforced? Also complex, but includes some of the biochemicals of such as oxytocin, dopamine, these things that reinforce this behavior so that our species can take care of itself, that I can take care of another person, that we can take care of each other. So I think that is a bit of a shift. Now, there then is this whole issue around self-compassion, and our medical training environments, unfortunately, have lag behind, our current thinking about all of this, and they have to catch up as well. In some places, in some ways, and at some times, they are in some ways toxic and actually set the soil in such a way for growth in healthcare as a professional to be one in which we don't have that compassion for ourselves. We don't take care of ourselves. And so that becomes a problem itself.
Yeah. And it's so interesting you bring this up because I will show you after our conversation today an image I use in my 8th class in my burnout and my mindfulness courses that draws this pyramid with sympathy, empathy, compassion, self-compassion. And the distinguishing characteristics that you bring in there are the same ones that I use because what you're talking about is based on research. And so this is put together is there's a difference between sympathy. I see someone slip and fall, but I don't know them. So there's a limited personal engagement with that. Empathy. Ooh, that's my kid who slipped and fell. I'm very much invested in that. And compassion. I can help them up. I can do something about it. And I start that class just by asking, hey, how does it feel when you help somebody out? Pretty good. Like, hey. And then eventually we get around to the idea of empathy fatigue or sympathy fatigue. I don't see that so much. All right. I see that because that's just taking on distress, but compassion fatigue, not so much. Because that's healing. How do you feel when you help somebody out?
Right. Yeah, that's a bit of a misnomer, isn't it, Ted? It's probably better said empathic overload or something, something along those lines. Yeah, and then another whole domain that doesn't get talked about as much, but we're understanding maybe more now is our stress response is incredibly beautiful, incredibly necessary. It's absolutely vital to our survival. But the part of the stress response that we don't talk as much about is the affiliative stress response, that part of the stress response that connects us, that tend and befriend, that begins to engage the healing part of our nervous system, the parasympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system, for example. And I think acts of compassion, ways of connecting, do this, engage that. We went back to our initial group of 70 physicians from that initial study, and we did a qualitative study a year later, and asked them, what was important about the program for them, and they listed three things. One was isolation. This at least was a place where they met regularly, connected with their colleagues on many levels, enjoyed themselves, talked about important things. The second was the practices themselves, the contemplative practices they felt was really important. The way of how to learn deep listening and how to speak and share your stories, the narratives, and then how this appreciative approach to dialogue they really felt was important. The third thing, which really was one of the most challenging, was they were still in a lot of conflict about self-care, feeling very responsible and overwhelmed by the amount of things in their lives, in particular their professional life, that they have to do, that even though we show these improvements on all these domains for them in burnout and well-being, they still struggle with the idea that they should take care of themselves, which is really interesting.
And that shows up again and again. Stories about the Dalai Lama having difficulty understanding a question about taking care of oneself because it was such an alien concept to him that self-compassion was not really much of a thing.
Right.
And we see that again and again. Just yesterday in class, asking people, how much time do you spend taking care of others during a given week? Just ballpark, how much is it? And of course, lots and lots and lots, especially in healthcare, since that's our profession. Okay, how much time do you spend intentionally taking care of yourself? And people will admit it's much, much lower. And that's one of the challenges that we face, is that this is not something as, I think, well understood or is embraced as much as it needs to be. And I want to ask you, what are some things that you see as some changes that we still have room to improve in healthcare in particular, and ways mindfulness might help with that? I think this is a really good segue into that.
Yeah. Well, I think people are beginning to share more and more about their subjective experiences in their medical work among colleagues, and I think that's a really healthy thing. There has been this very kind of typical way of keeping everything close into yourself, not really sharing the challenges and the difficulties, or really even sharing anything about the work. In fact, although I think people from outside of medicine may feel that many of their health professionals lack humility, within the profession, I can tell you that people are extremely humble. They don't show off the things much that they do, the extraordinary things that they do on a daily basis. And I think there's something about sharing both the extraordinary things that we do and seeing them for what they are, extraordinary, because they are, and also being able to share in the challenges and the difficulties equally is a much healthier place to be. We can talk more about errors, and we know that errors in healthcare are 80+%. The estimates are that they are a result of really systemic and organizational structures rather than any individual person. Although we're taught in our training in medicine that, the buck stops here, it's all about me. And there's a huge amount of imposter syndrome, feelings and thoughts that, boy, somebody's going to find me out. I'm not really supposed to be here doing this. And that's exceedingly common because the psychological safety hasn't been cultivated enough to allow people to talk really freely about things that could impact you and I, patient care, the health of our communities. So things are starting to change in that. And it requires mindfulness. It requires the ability to see where we're at honestly. There's an acceptance element there, not resignation. Actually, completely different than resignation, accepting and saying, this is where we are right now. What can we do? What's the path forward? To really bring in non-judgment into it, that this is just part of what it means to work in complex, imperfect organizations and systems, and to be a complex and imperfect person as well, human being who does our best and intends to continue to do better, but still fails at times, and creating a culture in which that's okay to talk about for the sake of actually improvement, really, and also for the sake of our well-being, so we don't have to just carry that. And to suffer is to carry it. We just sort of hold on to it and aren't able to put it down. Well, I think there are forces and culture change in healthcare that's beginning to have that effect. On the other hand, there is extremely potent business pressures that are in some ways acting in a countervailing way to that. And that's really, really challenging. We work within a system, an economic system, that those pressures remain, and I think they do have a detrimental effect. One of the things we show in our training, we show a painting of Prometheus. Your listeners probably know Prometheus was the person or demigod who brought fire to human beings, and Zeus, the supreme power in the universe, was not very happy with this. In fact, he was pretty pissed off, and he supposedly, chained up Prometheus to a stone, to a big boulder, and every day an eagle comes and picks at his liver, and then at night the liver regenerates in the next day. And we ask, the participants, what's picking at your liver every day in your work? Like they feel like Prometheus. And, a lot of it has to do with the organizational and systemic things. And what they begin to realize is that they're actually very, very resilient. They have what it takes. It's not that they don't belong there. It's that these systems are complex, and they're driven in some ways by productivity pressures, and the electronic health record, which is great, but far, far, far from perfect, as you know, and other demands, not to mention the things we talked about earlier, these highly emotional charged situations with a great deal of uncertainty, being in positions of high responsibility, but very little control. These are really challenges for us. So, but I think one of the problems, I think, with the idea of injecting mindfulness into healthcare is just our use of the common usage of mindfulness. I think it's become, there's a lot of cynicism out there, because I would say maybe those business pressures, the commodification, corporatization of products sold with the moniker mindfulness makes a lot of people feel like, I don't know, this isn't what we need. The other message, which I hope your listeners are able to, the nuance of this message are able to understand, is that I don't necessarily think the individual health professionals need to go out and take a mindfulness course and be more mindful. I think our systems need to become more mindful. Organizations need to become more mindful. How to get there, I don't have the answers, but I'm working on it.
Working on it. And I'm glad you are. And two things about what we were just talking about is that you mentioned that systems, that so much of the difficulties that show up, and certainly causes of burnout, are not individuals having difficulties. It's not failures in that. It's that the systems are set up in a way that make things more difficult. And the biggest effects in changing physician, nurses, other healthcare profession burnout is to move the needle, even just a little bit, on some of the systems. And that systems, that's a very big word. That's policies, procedures, best, finger quotes here, best practices, whatever it happens to be, that can show up in a lot of different ways. And the second thing is, for those of you who are wondering about poor Prometheus, and his torture. Hercules set him free. It's why he ended up having to do the 10 labors that eventually became 12. So don't worry, he's not
Thank
being
you.
eaten by an eagle every day.
Thank
So I
you.
want to shift gears a little bit here to you are making a documentary, and I'm wondering if you're able to say a little bit more about that as well as your new podcast too.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much. I wasn't expecting you to bring up those areas, but yes. So, about 4 years ago, I've been a medical educator, always teaching students, trainees, residents uh, for my entire career. And I become really quite interested in how these young folks begin to take on that identity of being a professional and what that means to them and how that happens and what are the challenges to that. So I had an idea and started producing a documentary film that we're calling The Healer's Journey, where now we took a group of five medical students from our medical school here at the University of Rochester on their first day of medical school and have been following them through their entire program. They're now in their fourth year. In 3 months, they're going to graduate. They're going to be physicians. Um, so it's really early for them because medical training is quite a long time. It's a craft that really requires a lot of experience and supervision. Um, but we've been following them, and it's just been a fabulous experience, creative experience, in some ways a very mindful experience. I've had to really drop a lot of judgments about certain things, and I've learned so much about, so many aspects. A little bit about filmmaking. I'm working with a professional, multi-Emmy award-winning filmmaker named Dave Marshall, whose films are usually about social justice issues, mostly for the public television type audience. And that's what we're hoping this will find home in. So I've learned about that. I've learned about fundraising, which is what I do as an executive producer, is try to get this thing covered financially so we can continue to complete it. And then learning about just working with the students and trying to see things through their eyes, which from the beginning of the project, our idea was that, I may have some ideas about medical education, but what I really want the viewer to see is what's it like through the eyes of the students. And we've been able, I think, more or less to do that. So that's really exciting work. Have a few more filming episodes with them, and then they graduate, and then it's going to be the post-production and hopefully put it all together. The podcast, I've been working with a medical malpractice insurance company for probably 15 years, doing some educational consulting and teaching for them. This is a company in New York City, and they have a wonderful peer support network program. They offer a number of different offerings to their population of physicians. It's physician malpractice that they insure to improve their well-being, because they see very, I think, correctly, that their well-being and malpractice risk are intimately associated. So they asked me about 6-8 months ago if I would be interested in starting a podcast and what would the topic that I would be interested in. And so we now have a podcast, 2 episodes a month right now coming out. We have about 6 episodes out already and about 15 recorded. And so it's called Flourishing in Medicine: From Surviving to Thriving. And we have a variety of guests, wonderful guests from all over the world, actually, who are engaged in medicine. They may not be practitioners, they may physicians, they could be in some other aspect of medical work, and the conversations are really about flourishing, about what are they doing to help flourish, and what's the future that our health professionals could work at their best, find meaning and joy, provide the highest quality, and also continue to do their work. So that's both of those projects. You can find those on most of the streaming services, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc.
Great. Thank you for sharing that as someone who's been podcasting for a while. I know you will find this as it continues to unfold to be such a rich and terrific experience just talking with others who are in this field. So, best wishes on that. And for other people who are here listening and not checking where I am going to post links to these things, what links can you say to people who are listening right now about where to find you and learn a little bit more about your work?
Yes, thank you, Ted. This is really generous of you. Well, I have a personal website now. I retired from my post at the university about a year ago. I'm now a professor emeritus of medicine, which means I need to grow a beard or something like that and really look sagacious or something. And so I have a personal website, and it's Mick Krasner, M-I-C-K. Most people call me Mick, MICK, KRASNER-MD.com. It's quite simple, mickkrasnermd.com. And then another place that you may find interesting is our Mindful Practice website. It's a site at the University of Rochester, but it has a .com address. And we have all our programs there, and many other resources for folks, research resources, recordings, things that we're doing, speaking engagements, etc. And that's Mindful Practice in Medicine, one long word, mindfulpracticeinmedicine.com. And that's, I think that's the most, you can find me on LinkedIn, just search me and etc. But those two websites would get you to me, certainly.
Great. Well, thank you for being here today, and I hope you'll come back because I know we're going to have more to talk about, and we can keep going on today for several hours. But I appreciate your time today. Our guest, for those who are watching and listening, Mick Krasner. Mick, thanks so much. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Ted. Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Mick Krasner. I know I did. And if you'd like, if this is helpful to you in some way, subscribing helps not just this podcast, but it also helps other people to find it. So until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time.